Good evening. I'm Maggie Ferguson. I'm the literary editor of The Tablet, and I'm hugely honoured to introduce this conversation between the Reverend Sarah Coakley and Father Erik Varden, marking the publication of Father Erik's new book, Entering the Twofold Mystery. Of course, we're sorry not to be all together in person this evening, but it's maybe quite a good thing that this event is online, as it has proved so enormously popular. There is absolutely no way we would all fit into the bookshop. There are well over 200 of us here this evening. Just a few quick points before I introduce our speakers. Copies of Father Erik's book are available from the bookshop at the special price of £12.99. And just the shape of this evening, we'll have a 45-minute discussion, followed by 10 minutes for questions. So if you want to ask a question or make a comment, perhaps you could type it into the chat box at the bottom of the screen. And if you could do this by 7 o'clock, that would be great. So we have a chance to look at the questions. Thank you. Sarah Coakley is an Anglican priest, a systematic theologian, and a philosopher of religion, who was for many years Norris Hulse Professor of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. She's had so many other distinguished appointments that you have to forgive me for not listing them all, because we just run way over time. But I was intrigued to discover from Wikipedia that her brother is a legal advisor to Prince Charles. I suspect that'll be out with the scope of this evening's conversation. Erik Varden is Bishop of Trondheim in his native Norway and former abbot of the Cistercian Abbey of Mount St Bernard in Leicestershire. How can a bishop continue to be a monk, I wonder? I hope we're going to discover. 3 years ago, when Father Erik published his astonishing study, Remembrance, The Shattering of Loneliness, I was sent by the chapter to him at Mount St Bernard. His days there were numbered, but I think he didn't know this then. Many things have stayed with me from our conversation, and one is what Father Erik had to say about the danger of getting stuck, a particular hazard, he told me, for monks. The fearful possibility of stalling should motivate us until our last breath, he wrote. So I asked him, what are the signs that someone is stuck? And he answered, a loss of joy. And how do you get unstuck? To that he directed me to St. Anthony of Egypt, who started each day by saying, today I begin. Father Erik said, when you endeavour to live life seriously and zestfully, it is constantly new. Every day is like the first day of creation. I found that quite thrilling. That's enough for me now. Over to Sarah and Erik.
Well, Father Erik, it's such a privilege to be part of this conversation. And
it's wonderful, and thank you for being available for it.
And you do have a very unique way in your writing of combining erudition with complete accessibility, spiritual depth with biblical precision, and a wonderful array of more poetic and literary examples all woven in. But the book starts with an unforgettable story of your confronting a homeless man on the street in Paris, which precipitated in you your monastic conversion of life. And I will just read one little paragraph, if I may, to start our discussion, where you say on 15, within the mystery of the Church, we dare to believe that a Christian life truly given may, by God's providence, be an effective balm on the wounds of the poor of our world, who are given us to carry and nurture. But as we go into the main part of the book, we realize that actually it's a series of addresses that you have given over some years to your confreres in the Cistercian order. And so it's inevitable that I ask you first, how can a set of addresses to monks have applicability to those of us who live very unmonastic lives?
Now, the monastic life fascinates when seen from the outside on account of everything that makes it specific. People see big edifices, they hear the bells, they hear the chant, they see people wearing strange clothes and observing strange rituals, and it can seem like something very, very other. But those are just the tools, and fundamentally, the monastic life is simply an attempt to live as a Christian coherently. And the life as such, it says in the constitutions of our order, is obscure, laborious, and ordinary. And that I can testify to the truth of that statement. So I think what makes the monastic life relevant is that it endeavors to be an applied way of living faith, applied discipleship. When the first monks went into the desert, it was because they were conscious of their baptismal commitment, and they could see that they needed props to live them out. They needed props in terms of a community of support, a little bit of distance from distraction. And this they found in an experimental way by developing the monastic institute, which came about obviously in different ways, at different times, in different places, in Northern Africa, in Egypt, in the Middle East, in Southern Europe to some extent. One of the great monks of the 4th century, Evagrius Ponticus, who was a theologian of note, a friend of the Cappadocian Fathers, is famous for the statement that a monk is someone who is separated from everything and united with everyone. And I think there's something of that relatedness that, obviously monks and nuns are aware of, but also people who come into contact with monasteries see that a profound solidarity, being rooted in the deeply human and being oriented towards the transcendent. And obviously, there is a great communication there by the fact that monks and nuns pray for the world.
Could we go now and probe a bit more deeply into the specific 3 vows that are distinctive to the Benedictine and Cistercian tradition? Because you spend a lot of time on this very illuminatingly in the first chapter of the book. Of course, Benedictines take for granted poverty and chastity, but the vows are obedience, stability, and conversion of life. I wonder whether we could spend a little time on each of these, because you have very illuminating and novel things to say about each. In relation to obedience first, in our contemporary culture, we tend to think of obedience as capable of being abused by those in power against the powerless. We tend to value autonomy very highly since the Enlightenment, and autonomy and obedience don't seem very compatible. You have a lot to say about this in chapter 1. Could you reduce it to a few aphorisms for us here?
I can try it. I entirely concur that obedience can be very dangerous, which is why it requires great discernment. The monastic tradition and the whole, particularly the Greek Eastern tradition, the Greek Christian tradition, would be skeptical with regard to the notion of autonomy, and they would say that it's simply false, and they would argue for the falseness of that statement by virtue of man's ontological status as being created in the image of God and being sustained by God. If God stopped sustaining us, we would cease to exist. So we are, by nature, dependent creatures. And the great originality of the Christian position is that by owning that dependence, I don't become a slave, but I do actually become free, because the power that sustains me, that has willed and loved me into being, is an infinitely benevolent power that has a plan for my life that coincides with my own happiness, and even that directs me towards beatitude. So in living by obedience, the monk tries simply to live according to the principles that correspond to his the deepest truth of being and the deepest truth of his longing and desire. Obviously, our notion of obedience, the word obedience, comes from a Latin root, audire having to do with auditive things. So obedience is firstly a matter of listening. It's a response to a call which directs my life towards thriving. But as I said, there are many safeguards regarding the exercise of obedience. St. John Climacus, a monk of the 7th century, who was the abbot of the monastery of Sinai, said something very paradoxical, but I think very true. He says that monastic obedience is a matter of relinquishing discernment through a superabundance of discernment. And what do you mean? The superabundance of discernment is about looking at this whole project from the outside first, having made a preferential option for risking the Christian proposition, considering the monastic rule, the monastic institute, and coming to the conclusion that that seems to be a way that works. Then considering the concrete community that lives under that rule in this particular place, and ascertaining that it seems to work for them. It seems to change these people for good. And then to say, well, I'm going to risk it too, because this seems a reasonable position. But that trust has got to be there first. And obviously that trust is something that the monastic institute, the ecclesial institute, has got to earn. We find ourselves now, sadly, in a situation in which many institutions and institutes have proved themselves historically not very trustworthy. But that doesn't mean that the proposition as such is invalid. And on the contrary, the great task is to try and rebuild that trust and to be worthy of it.
We may come back to that point a little later, but I've already indicated that the building of obedience in its best form in a monastery is distinctly related to the next vow of stability. And one might think that stability simply means sticking in one place, not rushing around, although I notice that you do quite a lot of rushing around as a bishop. But it means a bit more than just staying put, doesn't it? Otherwise, it would be hard to see how it could be applied to postmodern non-monks who, of necessity, actually, in our lives, often have to move around a great deal.
Well, stability is first and foremost about an inner rootedness that normally will coincide with rootedness in a place. But in terms of the technicalities of the vow of obedience, it means that I pledge myself to remain a member of this particular community for life. So the stability is a human stability within a human group, and that group may move around. You mentioned our postmodern world with its instabilities, and that's certainly very true. What strikes me when I think about the 5th century and the 6th century, when the Benedictine project really flourished, was that they were also pretty unstable centuries. And I think monastic stability is a kind of response, it's a countercultural response. It's rooted in a resolve not just to move with the flow or not to move with the crowd, to remain rooted in the place. It's a very organic form of living, based on the conviction that it's only by being rooted in a particular soil that I will grow and be fruitful. And I think we see that when we meet people who've simply been faithful to a commitment, faithful to a relationship, faithful to a task. I find it very interesting that with some of the, to my mind, great heroes of contemporary literature are people who sort of embody stability. Think of John Ames in Madeline Robinson's Gilead, who spent all his life in this tiny town of Gilead in Iowa. Or I think of something like Jacob Crow in Mendel Berry's book, who's been a barber in this small town, this time in Kentucky. And simply by remaining faithful to the place, remaining faithful to the community that makes up that place, there is a depth of wisdom that they embody, and also a warmth of compassion. And I think that is one of the fruits that stability will ideally produce.
I think many of us find ourselves actually living in more than one community and flipping between them, as it were, in our mores, often unconsciously, because that's the kind of pressure that our lives today make on us. So your recalling us to think about stability in this new way is very fruitful.
Suppose a constant renewal of that resolve, because the monks of the desert were extremely lucid about this, and they knew very well that your body might be unmoved in a hut somewhere in Sketis in the desert, but your mind could be shopping in Alexandria. So that ongoing resolve to actually remain put and to remain rooted, and that can actually be maintained even when physically, by circumstances or by vocation, you have to move around quite a bit.
On the third vow, conversion of life, it seems to me that this is the theme that runs right through the whole book, and you might say it's what the book is about. Again and again, you come back to the issue of how we tend to recoil these days against the deep demands of conversion of life, the requirement that the mystery of suffering, for instance, is an inevitable and necessary part of sharing in the life and death of Christ. And do you feel in some ways that even Christians today have come to find this idea of costly ongoing transformation unto death somehow repulsive and offensive? Do people these days rush to churches to try and avoid this rather than to embrace it?
My impression is that people find it both a very forbidding proposition and a very attractive proposition, but particularly, especially attractive for others. It is more demanding to embrace it oneself, but in its root sense, I mean, conversion is about orientation, it's about turning round and moving towards a goal. So conversion presupposes having a fixed goal. And I think something that makes a lot of people in our modern world unhappy and frustrated is that they don't really know what their goal is in life, or what the goal of life is as such. And I think there, as Christians, we actually have some very interesting things to say. It's interesting that in St. Benedict's rule, in the first chapter on the types of monks, he says that there are various types. He says, and that the worst type of all is that of the gyrovague.
Who just rush about. Yeah.
And who's someone who just walks in circles. Whereas the whole notion of the rule, the regula, is that it points the direct line from A to B, A being the point at which my life is now, and B being the goal I desire to reach, which is the vision and knowledge of God. That path in a Christian optic will necessarily go through the cross, but the cross obviously is a passage. The cross is the emblem of the mystery of Christ's Pasch, his Passover. So it's there looming large on the horizon, but it bears the promise of the new life and the endless life and the flourishing on the other side.
That comes right to the heart of the very title of the book, doesn't it? It's actually a quotation from one of the people you reflect on in the book, a poet. And I think you might like to just quote that yourself, because it takes us into the heart of the next question that I have for you, which is, how are we to conceive of the suffering to which we are drawn in being united with Christ in our baptism? And how can we avoid a false kind of wallowing in suffering, or a false kind of evasion of it? But I think you want to appeal to your poet here, probably.
But the title is part of a quotation that occurs in the book from a poem by Elsa Morante, an Italian poet who died in 1985, whom I got to know more or less by chance. When I lived in Rome, I had a medical appointment for a chest infection, And when I went to see the doctor, there was a little plaque on the wall saying, the poet Elsa Morante lived here. So that made me curious. I went out and got a book of poetry and then found this poem. This is just a brief passage from it, from the beginning, in which he says, "Alone the lover knows. If you love not, I pity you. The myriad lives will seem to you then but common and cheap, like the sacred host to unconsecrated eyes. Only the lover has eyes to see the splendors of the other, with access to the house of twofold mystery, the mystery of sorrow and the mystery of joy." And when I quote that in the book, it's from a homily from Maundy Thursday, and it's a way of trying to comment on the gospel for that day, which is from the 13th chapter of the Gospel of John, where the evangelist says that Jesus loved those who were his own in the world, he loved them to the end. And what does it mean to love to the end? I mean, love is one of those words that is at one and the same time almost too banal to speak and too sublime to speak. I think we have pretty mixed up sort of notions of love very often in our various languages, thinking of love as something to do with sentiment, with emotion, with a state of felt well-being. And those can all be components. But I think one of the marvelous things about this poem, which is not a specifically Christian poem, and I think it points to a deeply Christian mystery, is that love is not incompatible with pain. And in a certain way, love almost presupposes pain, because by loving someone and by being loved, I am vulnerable. And I open myself, and I'm open to the deepest truth of another. And I love the way in which he talks about the one who doesn't love is like one who sees the consecrated host and the monstrance. So the sacrament of divine presence in a Catholic consciousness with unconsecrated eyes. Mm-hmm. So that in order to perceive the holy, I need to integrate it in myself and sanctify my way of looking at the world and looking at others. And that is at one and the same time a painful and a thrilling thing. So when putting that as a title, it was a way of sort of desentimentalizing love, if you like. And I mean, and love has got to be the motor of conversion. Otherwise, it's not going to take us very far.
In fact, the book is absolutely fulfilled in its goals, I think, by the wonderful usages you make of individual saints, known and unknown, official saints and unofficial saints, who illustrate all your points as you go along. And this is one of the most striking and remarkable features of your writing. Are there others mentioned in the book you'd particularly like to focus on here, just as we're talking together?
What interests me, I'm coming back to the first point in a way about monastic life. I'm not particularly given to abstract thinking, and I'm not particularly gifted for abstract thinking. And what's always fascinated me in Christianity and in the Christian proposition and the Christian revelation is the sheer concreteness of it. That Christianity is about life. It is not theoretical. Sublime and beautiful and very important theories have been developed on the basis of the Christian proposition. And by all means, it's important to engage with them. But fundamentally, Christianity is about an encounter, which is a transformative encounter, which actually changes my life. And so I'm always interested in these case studies. And if you like, the calendar of saints that goes throughout the church's year, it's a range of case studies showing how this works out in practice. And so in the second part of the book, which I call the monastic year, I've endeavored to do something, I mean, in a very sort of modest way, that the Cistercian Fathers did, which was a way of trying to propose a Christian catechesis, an account of the main truths of Christian life, simply by commenting on the main feasts of the Church's year. So the seasons first, and then what we now call ordinary time, and then the calendar of saints. And I've drawn there on examples that have been challenging to me and inspiring to me. I've also tried to bring out some characters that are perhaps less well known than they might be. A couple of 20th century saints from my own order, the Cistercian Order of Strict Observance, Blessed Gabriela Saghettu, who was a Sardinian nun of the monastery of Grottaferrata, who had this profound sense of scandal at Christian disunity, at this fact that the body of Christ is wounded, and gave her life for that cause, for Christian unity, and was proclaimed a patron of that cause by John Paul II. Another, called Rafael Arnaiz Baron, a Spanish monk, who was an architect, a very gifted artist, whose life was plagued by illness, in some way a bit of a failure, but who found in monastic life really a way of, for all its strictness, he found that the regularity of monasticism actually channeled all the complexities within him. Ingmar Bergman, the director, whom I very much admire, once said that, and it's borne out in his films, that in order to render a very complex story, a very complex content, you need a great strictness of form. And I think that's what monastic life can provide sometimes for people like Raphael. But I also like to draw on people who might, I mean, who are not canonized and perhaps not very canonizable. One of them, which I mean, that is a bit of a favorite example of mine, is Clarissa Dixon Wright, one of that redoubtable duo of chefs, the two fat ladies, who speaks of how she was making jam one day in a state of considerable inebriation. She had been a struggling alcoholic for a long time, and she spilled jam on the floor, so she was on the floor, mopping it up. She was raised a Christian Catholic, I think, but she says, I haven't prayed for years, but there, since I found myself on my knees anyway, I said, dear Lord, this can't go on. And it didn't, because whether it was that very day or the next day, she was arrested by the police for drunk driving. And so began a process of healing. She reflects on this in an interview in Desert Island Discs, actually, very movingly. And I think it's wonderful the way one can seem as the absolute low point of an existence, in fact, turns out to be a turning point and a moment of grace and of illumination, humiliating, but at the same time freeing and enabling a new foray into a future that had seemed extinct.
Another one of the saints, or modern unrecognized saints, you reflect on is someone who actually suffered lengthy mental illness. And it's not often remarked upon, I think, that the act of contemplation itself is a bit of a danger for those who may be so inclined towards depression. And I wonder what you could say to a generation now that is suffering such an enormous amount of anxiety and mental distress in the face of the pandemic. What can one learn from monastics who suffer depression that might give them some sense of hope in the travail of darkness they find themselves in?
One can learn, as in this example that I cite of a German nun of the order who died quite recently, the sheer refusal and the dogged refusal to let go of hope she was someone who lived in great darkness for a number of years, but who also experienced the lifting of that darkness and the entry afterwards into what her sisters recount as just an extraordinarily contagious, deeply embodied joy. I think one's got to be very, very cautious. There's a fine line between a sense of bewilderment and inner loss that is spiritually induced, and that can have something to do with a process of spiritual or even mystical purification, and psychiatric illness. And there one's got to be extremely rigorous in one's diagnosis and not try to treat something spiritually that may require clinical attention. I mean, that's simply part of being realistic and humble. And at the same time, I think one needs to be open to the possibility that illness, physical illness and soul illness, can have a graced potential. And that's where I think an example such as that of this Sister Donata can be of great encouragement.
Perhaps I could also ask you now to reflect on some slightly trickier elements in the book that come up that relate to our agonies today about sexuality, gender, abuse, and so on. You're not afraid of tackling them. But the way you tackle them, I think, is very different from the way they're often tackled, even by public theologians, because of your monastic perspective. So to take issues of gender first, we know, of course, from reading early monastics and ascetics that their lives were often, as it were, freed up in an extraordinary way from the gender presumptions of life in the city or life in the married condition. And I think you imply, as I've done also in my writing, that this might be a resource of great fertility, if I may put it that way, for contemporary thinking. Could you say a bit more about that?
Well, I think one of the things that I've always found very interesting and very liberating about monastic writings, I mean, going right back to the beginning, is the extreme straightforwardness with which monks and nuns speak of sexuality as an integral part of human being, as a part of our being made in the divine image, and thereby as a part of ourselves which is called, like every other part, to be transfigured and sanctified, but also as a part which is subject to great complexity and can be a source of great suffering. The Cistercian fathers were extremely fond of citing a line from the Song of Songs, which in the Vulgate rendering reads, "Ordinavit in me caritatem." He has set love in order in me. And they sort of took it for granted that the run-of-the-mill Christian and the run-of-the-mill monk or nun would come into their Christian commitment with a certain amount of disorder. And that had to be, again, oriented, to come back to that fundamental monastic theme, and ordered for the purposes of freedom and flourishing. I think you raised the question of gender. One of the great challenges of the celibate state is that one needs to try and integrate in oneself that complementarity between man and woman, which is normally a fruit of marriage and of that symbiotic union. And I think that the example I cite in the chapter where I try to reflect on this is by a Cistercian called Isaac of Stella, who was an Englishman who was abbot of the monastery in France in the 12th century, who reflects on virility. He says, this thing that we've undertaken, this monastic project, is a manly task, he says. And that's a remarkable book. I think we would be extremely cagey now about talking about anything at all as a manly task, because it seems to us so charged with
stereotypical presumptions.
exactly. Whereas, in fact, he sort of turns it around, because he says manly in this respect is to be reasonable. It's appealing to, I mean, obviously he's presupposing an anthropology that was deeply pondered and carefully expressed both by the philosopher of antiquity and by the Christians of antiquity. But he says we must engage in the monastic pursuit, the Christian pursuit, engaging our virile faculties of reason and determination. But that in a view to rendering possible that feminine capacity of receptivity in order to receive the life of Christ in us and give birth to it. The Cistercians were sometimes very, very daring in their use of maternal imagery, for example, or, given their love of the Song of Songs, of drawing that parallel between the seeker, who in their case was a male subject, and the bride in the song. So I think, I mean, they would take it for granted that part of our human task is to be firmly lodged in our biological self, our embodied self. But they also have very clear ideas of the multiplicity of worlds that we need to integrate in ourselves in order to become whole. And holiness ultimately is a function also of wholeness, of integrity.
Of course, most recent developments in trans thinking and queer theology would be suspicious even of that complementarity theme that you've outlined. Do you think that monastic thinking is capable of responding to that challenge? Because even while Isaac is talking in the way he's talking, he's in a way also reinscribing certain gendered presumptions and then playing with them. Do you see the problem?
He would take it for granted that some gender presumptions are true and actually correspond to things as they are. And obviously presupposed in his thinking as well as the categories of antiquity is the Genesis account of creation, which I think if one is to present a Christian reflection on this theme has got to be to some extent normative.
We could go on further about that because, of course, there's a difference between how the Eastern Church interprets that in Genesis or many Eastern figures and Augustine, who, of course, most profoundly influences us in the West.
And I would stress again that the monastic fathers and the mothers would have a very variegated perspective on this. I mean, it's not as if they were trying to reduce something complex to something which is simple, simplistic. But they would set out from that view that we embody and have within us something which is complex and disordered, which is longing for order and direction with a view to flourishing and fruitfulness.
And that leads me to another difficult and even more painful question, which is that through the explosion of exposures of abuse in the Roman Catholic Church, including within monasteries in recent years, and we must not say that this is only a manifestation of the Roman Church, of course, but a realization that religious power, wherever it's manifested, is capable of appalling forms of misuse. But in the light of all that, from which we still continue to reel and recover, would you say that there is something that monastics today need to say afresh about how celibacy itself is not only possible, but transformative? Because I think many people have come to the conclusion, especially in the United States, where I'm currently living, that the abuses, say, in Boston, which I lived through at the beginning of the century, were the result of celibacy. They would blame it on celibacy. I don't agree with that myself, but I think there's a long way to go to make a theological and spiritual case again for the fruitfulness and efficacy of celibacy. Would you agree?
An exemplary case in terms of living truth. Because, I mean, the whole legacy of abuse is something that I live with, that we live with, I mean, as a continual pain. And as, I mean, it's a phrase I've used occasionally, I mean, it's like living within an open wound. And accepting that the healing of that wound will take a long time. And that it's something really to be, I mean, one simply got to shed tears of grief and of remorse on the judge's behalf, faced with that. That said, I do think it is simplistic to propose that celibacy somehow automatically engenders abuse or facilitates it. I mean, what maladjusted celibacy is terrible, even as maladjusted life in a couple can be terrible. I mean, maladjusted, unintegrated sexuality in general. And I think but it's not specific to a state of life. But that's where I think, again, I mean, you asked what the monastic tradition might have to contribute. I think above all, its realism and its truthfulness. And the fact that hasn't always been effective is a very good reason for rediscovering and recovering that particular part of our spiritual legacy. And I see many signs of that happening.
But do you think there needs now to be a kind of new genre of teaching in this area? Because when I talk to celibate friends about their formation, especially if they're a bit older than you are, they are likely to say, well, I was never really given any kind of real spiritual psychological resources. I was told what not to do, but I wasn't given the insights that I needed in order to maintain this difficult vow. You've been talking very interestingly just now about bad celibacy and bad marriage, and that reminded me of an extraordinary text that I'm sure you know by heart, by Gregory of Nyssa, his first text that he wrote, the De Virginitate, where really uniquely amongst the ascetic writers of his time, he sees good marriage as very, very closely related to good celibacy. That they're not opposites, as we often think, you know, one having sex and the other not. But that actually they need each other in order to help encourage each other in a particular, very hard form of faithfulness. Do you think we need new teaching of that sort?
There's a fundamental complementarity there, which is very interesting and also, I think, very beautiful. I'd say, I mean, to speak and think of, and even worse, to impose celibacy simply as mortification, as not doing certain things, or just trying to switch off a part of oneself. I mean, it's so obvious that it's almost embarrassing how necessarily fatal that is. I think one of the things that we really need is a renewed reflection on chastity.
Yes.
Chastity and celibacy are not the same thing. And I think, I mean, and chastity it's a word that's almost become an embarrassing word because it seems to be associated precisely with the denial of sexuality, when it isn't. And I think there in the Christian tradition, we have a tremendous wealth of resources to draw on that can be helpful both in practical terms and I think as a contribution to a wider discourse in society around these really complex themes that are omnipresent now.
Just one last very short question, because we want to take questions from outside. Your whole book actually manifests a cultural moment that I'm very aware of, that young people especially are very fascinated by asceticism and monasticism, but they wouldn't really want to do it. They would like to be, they'd like to be third order maybe. They'd like to go on retreats, but doing it, well, that's another thing. Could you just comment in closing about this phenomenon and about how you think it might be overcome? Or is it just a good thing, a kind of evolutionary cull, if you like, of our generation, that the wrong people are not becoming monks? Or perhaps the wrong people are becoming monks? I don't know the answer to this.
Is that there is, in fact, something of a post-cultural shift going on now. But I think that idea of sort of window shopping monasteries,
Yeah.
I've often thought that it's possible to have a kind of a promiscuous relationship with the idea of a monastic vocation. It's something I might do one day, but I've put it on hold as a tantalizing possibility. But like all tantalizing possibilities held on hold, they're not nourishing for very long. But I do I saw that in the monastery to some extent. I see it in the work I'm doing now with the people I encounter. And I have the joy of encountering many young people. That I think people now in their late teens, early 20s look at their parents, perhaps even at older siblings, and see that just standing back and not making committed choices isn't necessarily a way to be happy. And that there is, that's my perception, that there is an increasing readiness now to own that there comes a point, and it needn't be after I'm 40. When I had actually to make a choice for my life. Once, just after my doctorate, it was about that time I met Manu in Paris. I lodged with the Dominicans in Paris, and the oldest member of that community was invited one Saturday to give a talk to some young people in a bar that the friars were running at weekends. And after his talk, he invited questions, and the young fellow raised his hand immediately, and he said, "Father, how can I become happy?" And this man, who was almost 100 years old, I think he was 97, looked at him and he said, "Choose an orientation for your life and stick to it." And I thought that was pretty good advice.
Wonderful. Well, we've got time now for some questions, and I think they're going to flash up on the screen if we can manage that bit of the technology. Here we go. So we have one from Anita Dowsing. If baptism is an objective conversion of life, how does the church reach the baptized non-believers of today?
I think, first of all, by testimony. I think, and that's something, and again, to quote a monastic example, one of the earliest monastic lives we have is the life of Pachomius, who is often regarded as the founder of Cenobitic monasticism. He was, I think, late 3rd century here. He was a conscript who was more or less arrested in Egypt, driven up to the Nile on a ship, and then, in order that they shouldn't run away, put in prison before the next ship. And while they were there, lost and bewildered, about to start this military service that lasted several years, these eccentric individuals turned up with food and clean clothes and just kindness. And Pachomius said, "Why on earth are they doing this? Because they're not our cousins or uncles or aunts." And he was told, "Oh, they're a crowd called Christians, and they do this sort of thing because they think it's the right thing to do." And Pachomius was so bowled over by this, the fact that someone should be exercising gratuitous kindness to someone unknown to them and unable to give something back, that he thought, this is really interesting. If I get out of this military business alive, I'll make some inquiries, which he did. And I think, it is by living different lives. And that is I think it's a very wholesome challenge for us who call ourselves Christians. Does it show?
Mm-hmm. Here comes another one. Sister Mary Rose, can you follow a monastic life without being part of a community?
Life in its Benedictine form presupposes insertion into a community. But there are values in monasticism that are universal, because they are simply a kind of a distillation of the gospel. And that's something, again, we see now, which I see as a very hopeful and a very joyful thing, that a lot of people who may feel a bit lost with regard to Christian and church reference will look to monasteries and seek some kind of belonging, either in the form of third order, as you said, Sarah, or simply by making regular retreats. There's a very interesting initiative now, which has been launched in France, called the Monosphere, which is a way of enabling people to find properties close to a monastic life or some sort of shrine where there's a life of faith going on, in order to draw strength from that. I think, coming back to that Evagrian thing of being separated from everything and united to all, I think there is something in that interface between the monastic community and the world outside, which has always been life-giving, and that I think will remain life-giving for a long time.
Here we have another one. It was often the orders that gave an impetus for reform in times of crisis. Is my impression correct that this impetus is not yet visible in today's crisis? And what could be done about that? In other words, is it the responsibility of monastics to lead reform in some sense?
I think monastics get into trouble if they try to set themselves up as an example for others to follow. But monastics should, simply by virtue of the promises they've made, be examples of one kind or another. Unworthy examples, but nonetheless. And I think, the question, what can be done about that, I'd say the really crucial thing is a renewal of that commitment to conversion, a restatement of our sense of purpose, a clear restatement of the finality that we propose as the goal for our existence, and then coherence, joyful coherence, and charitable and hospitable coherence in pursuit of that goal. But I think what we see very, very clearly now is that a monastery never carries its monks or its nuns, for that matter. The spirit has got to be kept alive, and that's got to be nurtured. And that's where I come back to that statement of St. Anthony's that Maggie began with, which is very dear to me, that St. Anthony, who we know from reliable sources lived to be 104 years old, almost 106, would start every day saying, "Today I begin," and to really do that zestfully.
Here we get another. Dennis Campbell, please comment on people who are not remotely saintly in their lives, yet in their art or writing have deep insights into the nature of Christ. In many ways, your book is fundamentally about this, I think, Father Erik. So,
I'm being cautious about making judgments about who is or isn't remotely saintly. Because one of the things about sanctity is that it is quite often hidden, even to the people who actually embody it. And I think, fundamentally, what I'd say there is that, as Christians, we believe that the Son of God, becoming man, has assumed human nature as such, so that human nature is touched by the grace of the incarnation. And so a human being in its originality, by being created in the image of God, being put on by the incarnate Word of God, is somehow alive with the Word of God, whether it knows it or not. And so it shouldn't really surprise us all that much that we find traces of Christ, even in people who may not have conscious or owned faith, or even people who may be totally indifferent to faith. God is at work beyond our boundaries and categories, and thank goodness for that. And I don't know, I always found it very interesting to look out for those traces of Christ where you wouldn't expect him. And I find some of the most compelling embodiments of Christ that I found in my own life. And that story about the homeless person I met in Paris all those years ago is one illustration of that. I mean, I have no idea whether he was a man of faith or not, but for me, he remains and will always remain an incarnation, kind of an icon of Christ, and points me to this day in what in the right direction, showing me the way to go.
Of course, your questioner might want to press his question and say, but what of an artist or a writer who is rather manifestly wicked, destructive, and yet whose art somehow reflects incarnational presence? How does one cope with that paradox?
I'm not sure it is one to be thought out. Okay. It's one to be wondered at. I think there's spontaneously of reflection by someone who was in fact both a musician and a Benedictine nun, called Elisabeth Labatte, who reflects on precisely this. And she says that we must be extremely merciful in the way we look at great artists, because they live at such a depth where they are so vulnerable and exposed to such deep things that, as it were, coming back to just normality after the creative effort is such a shock that it can induce both confusion and very confused and destructive behavior. She says it much more sophisticatedly than that. But I think, once we touch a certain depth within ourselves, a spiritual depth, well, the Spirit is there, whether we know it or not. And the question is whether I will remain faithful to and try to coherently live out of that encounter and that call I may have felt in my depths, also when I go into the obscure, laborious, and ordinary.
We're coming to the end of our time, and we've got one last question, but we'll have to answer it very quickly. What might we learn from the monastic tradition about a sane pattern of daily living in the wider world? That's rather big one.
And I think one that's been very relevant during this time of pandemic, I think basically make a program. Don't do anything for too long. Shift from one activity to another. Have a sane and healthy mixture of intellectual work, thought work, manual work, prayer, time spent with others, time spent in solitude. Don't be dictatorial imposing this on yourself, but just work out the different ingredients in your life that are life-giving, and again, put them into some sort of order. That's, I think, the monastic recipe in a nutshell.
Thank you, Father Erik. This has been the most delightful interaction, and I must commend your book to all our listeners. I read it on my prayer stool, not at my academic desk with my red pen dangling over it, and it was a most rich experience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, what an absolutely amazing evening we've just had. Such a big thank you to Sarah and to Erik. I'm absolutely zinging with ideas, and I'm sure everyone is in the audience too. The idea that love is not incompatible with pain, and in fact might presuppose pain, that we're challenged to live coherently, to risk and trust and grow to be fruitful and compassionate, that we should dare to have a fixed goal. We have Lent coming up in just a very few weeks, and really, what could be better than to buy this book at the special price of £12.99 from the bookshop, and have it ready to read as we journey towards Easter. Thank you very, very much.